want to be in trouble.
Welcome to episode 59 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the surreal and erotic world of French director Jean Rollin and a time-jumping, twisted narrative from director JT Mollner. First up, we have Fascination from 1979, directed by Jean Rollin and starring Brigitte Lahaie, Fanny Magier, Franca and Jean-Marie Lemaire. Then we follow this with Strange Darling, released in 2024 and directed by JT Mollner. This stars Willa Fitzgerald, Kyle Gallner, Begley Jr and Barbara Hershey. Along the way, we'll be discussing the life and careers of Jean Rollin, JT Mollner, Willa Fitzgerald, Kyle Gallner, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, though, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in preparing this week's episode, and all sources used will, as always, be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing Fascination, I have referenced the books Fascination, The Celluloid Dreams of Jean Rollin by David Hines, and Eurogothic, Classics of Continental Horror Cinema by Jonathan Rigby. I've also referred to a documentary called Orchestrator of Storms, The Fantastique World of Jean Rollin, directed by Kat Ellinger and Dima Balin, as well as interviews and articles on the websites mondodigital.com, diaboliquefilms.com, cultcollectibles.com, slantmagazine.com, and kinoeye.org. And finally, I've also referred to interviews, features, and commentaries on the Blu-ray release of the film from Indicator Films. And when discussing Strange Darling, I have referred to interviews, articles, and reviews on the websites comicbookmovie.com, Yahoo Entertainment, Forbes.com, TheReader.com, NeonReviewJournal.com, The New York Times, and DreadCentral.com. I've also referred to festival Q&As and interviews with the cast and crew that can be found on YouTube, and I'll link to these in the show notes, along with all of the other references. I first encountered the films of Jean Rollin in the early 1990s, when I began diving headfirst into the world of Euro horror, particularly Italian cinema from the likes of Dario Argento, Michele Soavi, and Mario Bava. At the time, one of the only ways to see these films in the UK was to buy copies published by a boutique video company called Redemption Films, who essentially introduced Euro horror to the British home video market. However, Redemption also released some of their VHS titles, at least, with semi-erotic covers, regardless of the actual content. Even their release of Michele Soavi's Stage Fright, which is not a sexual film at all, sported a naked, blood-splattered woman wearing a bird mask on its cover. So, as you can imagine, it was sometimes a little embarrassing to go to the local HMV record shop and take these cases up to the counter. It was during this period that I saw my first Rollin film, Requiem for a Vampire. I'd read a few things about his movies and I knew that he was very highly thought of, but I still didn't know that much about him at the time. Rather stupidly, in hindsight, I assumed I would be watching something akin to Bava or Argento, all highly stylized and operatic violence, albeit with some rather questionable dubbing. What I saw, however, was about as far removed from these directors as it is possible to get, while still remaining within the Euro horror bracket. Extremely surreal and definitely erotic, the film more than lived up to the image Redemption used on the cover, and I rather hastily decided that perhaps his films weren't really for me, after all. But to be fair to my younger self, I clearly wasn't alone at the time. In the documentary, Orchestrator of Storms, Nigel Wingrove, the head of Redemption Video, recounts that the team in charge of the VHS transfer of the film were just as confused as I was and thought that he'd sent them the wrong tapes, by mistake. And that, for a while, was about as far as my relationship with Jean Rollin went. However, many years later, I decided to revisit his work, encouraged by the legion of devoted fans who clearly saw something in his films that I was missing. And so it's really only been in the last 10 years or so that I've begun to revisit his cinema with a much greater appreciation and through the eyes of a much wiser and sadly much, much older man. One day, I imagine, I should probably give them back to him. I tell this story for two reasons. Firstly, I am in no way presenting myself as an expert on all of his cinema. Of the 20 or so horror or horror-adjacent films that he directed, I've probably still only seen about 7 or 8. Some of them, like The Iron Rose, The Grapes of Death, and this week's film Fascination, I like very much. Others, I have to admit, I am not so fond of in their entirety, though each certainly has impressive visual elements that I admire greatly in and of themselves, even if some of the scores do grate on me just a little. Secondly, his films really aren't for everyone. For one thing, they are indeed erotic, with a great deal of nudity and a fair amount of sex, though there is of course a distinction to be made between the erotic and the pornographic, and much of it is relatively tame by today's standards. Often filmed without proper scripts, his films are sometimes uneven, sometimes confusing, and sometimes the acting is rather questionable. So if you've never seen a Jean Rollin movie, you may want to approach them with all of that in mind. But for those who do wish to pursue his cinema, if you're in the UK, most of his films can be found on the BFI player and are still distributed by Redemption, or its parent company, Salvation. And should you do so, what you will find are works that are, on the whole, unbelievably surreal and dreamlike, with some very striking imagery, which is no small feat given that they were made on limited budgets and shot with great speed. But even if you don't like his work, his persistence and determination to realise his singular artistic vision are certainly admirable. While some may see his films as pure exploitation, there is very much an artistic philosophy and possibly a political one behind them, even if this wasn't recognised alongside the more explicitly political films of the French New Wave. But this commitment caused him no end of commercial disappointment, particularly in his native France. Because, at the time he was making most of his films, which blur the line between horror, art house and erotica, he was very much swimming against the tide. Despite some of the films we've covered so far, like Eyes Without a Face and Les Diaboliques, France did not really have a tradition of horror cinema, which is one of the reasons why the new French extremity movement of the late 1990s and early 2000s was so explosive. Occasionally, some films would slip through, but they were very much the exception. And even compared with imported horrors from the US and British studios like Hammer, Rollin's work stands apart. In fact, there's probably a fairly strong argument as to whether some of them are really horror at all. As a result, Rollin was very much an outsider in his own country, his films often criticised and met with derision, and in the case of his feature debut, a full-scale riot, which led to him being chased from the cinema. In later interviews, Rollin did express some shock at this initial reaction, but also remained unrepentant, saying, quote, "Honestly, I don't care. Some people say I'm a genius. Others consider me the greatest moron who ever stepped behind a camera. I've heard so many things said about me and my films, but these are just opinions. I'm perfectly happy with what I do because it's always been my choice." End quote. He was born in November 1938 in Neuilly-sur-Seine, a western suburb of Paris. His father was an actor and theatre director, and his mother had worked as an artist model, so it's fair to say he was born into a creative family. His parents separated when he was very young, and he lived principally with his mother, though he would maintain a very good relationship with his father and would occasionally go to see his work on the Paris stage. His mother, Denise, however, would have a profound influence on his life and his later movies, particularly given her association with some of the intellectuals of the time, which included Jean Cocteau, the surrealist André Breton, and importantly, the writer and philosopher Georges Bataille, with whom she had a relationship between 1939 and 1943. Rollin would talk about Georges Bataille extensively in later life, and although he was obviously a very young boy at the time that his mother and Bataille were together, the influence of the writer-philosopher seems to have been quite profound. As a philosopher, sociologist, anthropologist, and writer, Georges Bataille's work explored the mystical, the surreal, and the erotic. It's been classed by many as the literature of transgression, with a focus on characters confined by the norms and expectations of society who then break free from those restrictions in unusual or illicit ways. Even from that brief description, just by watching one or two of Rollin's movies, you can see that Bataille's influence was really quite far-reaching into his later works. Rollin's introduction to cinema came at the age of 5, when he saw a 1942 film called Captain Fracasse, a historical drama set during the reign of Louis XIII. He was particularly captivated by a storm sequence in the film, and it was from this point on that, in his own words, he decided he wanted to be an orchestrator of storms and a creator of images, saying, quote, "I had never seen anything more fascinating and magical. It simply changed my life forever. My mother told me that after the screening, I said I wanted to do exactly that when I grew up. So making films is a desire I've carried with me for quite some time." End quote. As a schoolboy, he would frequent the Cinéac, a small cinema built within a railway station as a means for passengers to pass the time as they waited for their connecting trains. He became particularly enamoured with American serials, turning up each week to watch the latest installments of stories like Jungle Jim, The Shadow, and the mysterious Dr. Satan. He later said that, once an episode had finished, nothing was more important to him than getting through the following week as quickly as possible to see what happened next. When he was 15 years old, his mother gave him a typewriter because she thought it might be useful if he knew how to use one. He has called this the point where everything started, as it gave him a means by which to express himself, and he began to write little screenplays and stories heavily influenced by these serials that he saw at the Cinéac. Quote, "These serials were not just a special piece of culture, they also had a real spirit to them, which changed our lives and attitudes. I certainly know that these events are the source for most of the ideas that recur throughout my films. The spirit, structure, and contents of the serial are the key to my type of cinema. I work from childhood memories, and even if sometimes I cannot name a film in particular, I know that all my ideas originated from that time." End quote. When he was 16 years old, he began working at a film company called Les Films de Saturne, where he mainly dealt with the company's invoices and carried out general administrative tasks. Although the company specialised in creating opening and closing titles for movies, it also occasionally shot industrial shorts and brief documentaries, and one day Rollin found himself part of the crew on one of these projects. This was a documentary about a factory in France that built motors for aeroplanes, and though there were no actors and no fictional story to tell, the experience opened up a whole new world for him. He later recalled that on the set he did everything, from arranging the travelling shots to laying the tracks, checking the electricity, and helping the cameraman. In 1957, he began his military service, where he was assigned to the Army Cinema Department, where he worked on Army commercials as an editor. He also assisted with a documentary and an hour-long film called The War of Silence, which was his first exposure to working with both actors and a story. This experience, particularly his role in creating montages, later helped his career as a director. He would say that, as he began as an editor, he knew exactly where he wanted to have a cut, and so he would practically edit his films in camera. He would go on to say that he found editing a rather abstract process, and that he felt it was nothing more than a reflection of the filming process itself. For Rollin, the creation of cinema was something that occurred during the writing and shooting stages, and post-production was more about rearranging, quote, "a little bit here and there, but that's about it." End quote. A year later, he borrowed an old 35mm camera, headed to the beach at Dieppe, and made his first short film called The Yellow Lovers. This 11-minute black-and-white film features various characters on the beach, intercut with expressionist drawings depicting sex, violence and death, while extracts from poetry by the 19th century poet Tristan Corbière are read on the soundtrack. Rollin would return to this very beach and also to Corbière in subsequent films, and he later explained this fascination by saying, quote, "Corbière was a poet of the sea, and the sea is most important to me. My first short film was an evocation of Corbière on a beach near Dieppe. I was young, no money, no material, etc. But I was there, on that strange beach covered in stones, deserted, with just the cliffs and the seagulls. And in my mind I said, one day I'll come back here with all the possibilities for a real shoot. For me, now, after 6 or 7 films shot on that beach, it is all mixed with the remembrance of Corbière." End quote. He also said that he found Corbière to be somebody, quote, "really modern, ahead of his time, yet also very romantic and bound to the past. Someone twixt two worlds." End quote. One could also say the same thing about Rollin himself, and it's clear from this first short film that, even at this very early stage, he was setting out an artistic manifesto that would underpin many of his later films. The Yellow Lovers is currently available to watch on YouTube, though without the benefits of subtitles. So if your French is better than mine, and that's admittedly a fairly low bar, you may want to take a look. Sticking with the sea, in 1960 he began a feature called The Marine Route, but this was abandoned due to financial and production issues, and only 1 hour of footage was completed. He began his next short in 1961, which was a surreal and sentimental story called Sky of Copper. But before he could finish this, he once again ran out of money and eventually abandoned the project as he realised that it also really wasn't working out creatively. A year later, he worked as an assistant director on a film called A Horse for Two, directed by Jean-Marc Thibault, though he said this wasn't a particularly pleasant experience, and he also realised that he wasn't a very good assistant. Nevertheless, this was certainly an experience that influenced his later filmmaking style, as he would go on to say that it persuaded him to go in the opposite direction, becoming more instinctive and improvisational, trying things, making mistakes, and then trying to make something better the next time. Quote, "I think I know how a traditional classical film should be shot and what technique is required, but when I shot my first films, I tried to forget as much about that as possible. I wanted to work spontaneously without any of that unnecessary limitation." End quote. By this stage, the French New Wave, ushered in by the likes of Jean-Luc Godard, was beginning to revolutionise cinema. But Rollin decided to remain very much on his own self-created path of the fantastic and the bizarre, something that brought him into conflict with the more explicitly political cinema trends of the time. Nevertheless, in 1964, he did begin a documentary about General Franca, who we have mentioned many times now in this series. As you can imagine, this production, which was called Life in Spain and filmed under the noses of the Franco dictatorship, soon ran into trouble. Quote, "I was part of the left wing at the time, and there was an organisation here in France to help the Spanish resistance against Franco. I knew them, and they asked me to make a short documentary shot in Spain. I was interested, so we packed our camera equipment and went there. The resulting film, about 30 minutes long, wasn't very good, but we risked a great deal to get it made. There was another French crew shooting risky stuff in Madrid at that time. I don't know which company blew their cover first, but we suddenly found ourselves hunted by the police, and we managed to cross the border back into France just in time. It was close, very close." End quote. In 1965, he set up a production company, ABC Films, which would produce most of his subsequent films up to the time of his death. And it was under the aegis of ABC Films that he directed his first feature, which would be completed and released in 1967. This film came about following a meeting with an American promoter called Sam Selsky, who imported US films to show in French cinemas and on French TV. Selsky was one of the first promoters and producers who really trusted Rollin, and he gave him the funding to shoot his first feature. But as a feature was not exactly how it started off. It was originally intended as additional footage to pad out an existing film titled Dead Men Walk, which was originally made in 1943 and which had a running time of just 64 minutes. And so, accordingly, Rollin shot an additional 30 minutes of footage to be edited into this picture, but Selsky was so impressed with what he saw that he encouraged him to pad it out into a full-length movie, and this became his debut film, Le Voile de Vampire, or The Rape of the Vampire, a melodrama in 2 parts. Now, this is one of the Rollin films that I've not yet seen, but I will read you a brief description of it and the audience response, taken from the book Fascination, The Celluloid Dreams of Jean Rollin by the writer David Hines. Quote, "Within the first 10 minutes of Rollin's experimental and deliberately bizarre The Rape of the Vampire, the audience is presented with a variety of connected narratives that blur the past and the present. To add to the confusion, most of the characters are killed off after half an hour, yet they return for the second half. It is little surprise that its initial audience, no doubt expecting a Hammer-esque gothic vampire romp, was shocked by Rollin's deranged and surreal vision. At the premiere and subsequent theatrical showings, of which it received very few and only in Paris, the audience yelled in protest at the screen and caused riots. Cinema chairs were ripped from the stalls and thrown at the screen, along with anything else that might come to hand, such as food and drinks. At one screening, Rollin himself was actually pursued from the cinema and attacked by the audience. During the film's screening at the Scarlet Cinema, the police were called to repel the angered viewers." End quote. So, as you can imagine, quite the debut. He followed this with 1969's The Nude Vampire, which also opens with some incredibly surreal moments. These include a strange scientific procedure conducted by men in cloth masks, which is followed by a scene in which the female protagonist is pursued by a group of men wearing animal heads. There is absolutely no dialogue for the first 10 minutes, and actually not too much more after that, and while it does eventually come together, it is an incredibly strange journey to get there. It is perhaps less dreamlike than some of his later works, and does feel very much of its time, but it also seems to be making several points about class, secret conspiracies, and the corrupt nature of the elite. This, along with the use of masks, has led some to compare it with Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, though it is of course far less polished, much more supernatural, and arguably also far more oblique and strange. It did go on to receive a much wider distribution than his first film, and without any rioting, and it also did rather well in England, where it played in a dubbed version in 1973, though I suspect that might have been more to do with the female nudity than it was anything else. It also introduced a concept that would recur in many of his later films, that of twin girls, in this case identical, though in later work this would often be reduced to a pairing of non-identical female characters. And this is something we see in his next film, Shiver of the Vampires. This was released in 1970 and follows a honeymooning couple who come under the thrall of a female vampire who emerges from a grandfather clock, an image that recalls the paintings of René Magritte, who Rollin has cited as being an influence on his work. And with a vivid colour palette of reds, greens and purples, Shiver of the Vampire again has some incredibly striking imagery, particularly during the nighttime ritual scenes. And once again, it features a pair of mysterious female characters, though this time not identical, a theme that would continue on again with his next film Requiem for a Vampire, released in 1971, and strangely I still haven't rewatched that one yet. In 1973, he made The Iron Rose, a stunningly poetic film starring Françoise Pascal and Pierre Dupont. Once again, using poems by Tristan Corbière, this is in fact less of a film and more of a visual poem about a young couple who meet at a wedding and the next day go on a date in the cemetery. And of course, why wouldn't you? After some rather philosophical and existential discussions, the two make love in the cemetery and eventually become locked in. Featuring some incredibly eye-catching images, particularly the pair meeting beside a fog-shrouded and ancient steam engine, a clown laying flowers at a graveside, and Francois Pascal dancing balletically on top of a tomb, The Iron Rose is a meditation on life, love and death, and is possibly my favourite Rollin film so far. Sadly, it was a commercial failure, though Rollin seems to have anticipated this from the outset, later saying, quote, "I knew it would be a commercial disaster, I knew it from the beginning, but I didn't care. At that moment, it was very important for me to make a very serious and profound film, far away from the softcore stuff I'd done previously. I financed the picture completely with my own personal money, knowing I would never get it back. I love this film very much. It's definitely one of my most personal efforts." End quote. But at the very least, he had a safety net. The commercial failure of The Iron Rose coincided with a significant change in French legislation, the legalization of hardcore porn. As a result, Rollin was offered a deal by a company called Impex Films to direct 6 or 7 hardcore porn films. And so from here, Rollin moved into the world of pornography as a way to pay his bills, and this continued for several years. Of this, he would later say, quote, "I shot X-rated films to have sufficient money to be able to live. I don't like the films, but to make them can be amusing, and I remember that with pleasure. I liked the people I was working with. It was always 1 or 2 day shoots, very funny, and a good friendly atmosphere. But no interesting films, that's all I can say." End quote. However, at the same time, he also continued his work in fantastic cinema, albeit with a stronger sexual tone. At the suggestion of a producer called Lionel Woolman, and with largely Belgian money, for his next film, Rollin created a supernatural rape revenge drama called Les Démoniaques, or The Demonics. It was his biggest budgeted film so far, and his first with external financing, and by all accounts, the production was a nightmare. He was forced to use Belgian technicians with whom he had never worked. He did not get on at all well with his leading lady, and at one point the cast and crew were surrounded by angry locals, armed with guns. So you can see why shooting porn might have been easier. And it was while shooting porn that he first met and directed an actress called Brigitte Lahaie, who was working in adult movies, but who would cross over to star in his later films The Grapes of Death, this week's film Fascination, and The Night of the Hunted, released in 1980, roles which would go on to cement her reputation as an icon of French cult cinema. And although this might sound unusual, Lahaie is not the only actress who crossed over from adult entertainment and into the world of horror. In the US, at around the same time, David Cronenberg cast adult star Marilyn Chambers as the lead in his 1977 film Rabid, and a very good performance she gives in that too, by the way. And as well as going on to star in movies for Rollin, Lahaie would later appear in several other mainstream films, including the Philip Kaufman movie Henry and June, which was released in 1990, and the Belgian, not French, extremity movie Calvaire, released in 2004. In 1976, Rollin returned to the world of horror with Lips of Blood, another vampire movie that was another commercial failure in France. And then, in 1978, he made what for me is one of his strongest films, or at least the strongest that I've seen so far. And this was The Grapes of Death, also known as Pesticide. Taking a cue from the cinema of George Romero and also the film The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, this is a subversive zombie movie in which the pesticides that are sprayed on local vineyards have a dramatically adverse effect on anybody who drinks the wine. And more than one commentator has pointed out a great irony that one of France's greatest national exports should be used as a vehicle for zombie infection and violent mass destruction, though this, of course, was very much the point of the film. And it is indeed extremely violent, to such an extent that it is actually known as the French first gore movie. It is also his most conventional horror film, which may be one of the reasons that I prefer it to some of the others that I've seen. Even then, though, it features several of his stylistic quirks, and unusually, the infected villagers are also often overcome with grief and horror after committing their crimes, which is a very interesting touch for films of this period. We might circle back and cover it in more depth later in the series. I just have to work out what I want to pair it with. And, as I mentioned, this also features the non-adult film debut of Brigitte Lahaie, who demonstrates an incredibly strong screen presence. Rollin has said that her scenes in this film are a tribute to the actress Barbara Steele in Mario Bava's movie Black Sunday, and you can certainly see a comparison. Both are incredibly striking and charismatic women with a certain enigmatic aura whenever they appear on screen. And if Barbara Steele's appearance in Black Sunday created an iconic image to represent the Italian Gothic, Brigitte Lahaie did just the same for 1970s Euro horror in her next film with Rollin, Fascination. All of which does finally bring us on to our first film of the week, which is, of course, Fascination, directed by Jean Rollin and starring Brigitte Lahaie. Released in 1979, it also stars Fanny Magier, Franca and Jean-Marie Lemaire. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so if you haven't seen Fascination yet, it's time to come back once you have. The inspiration for Fascination came from a story called A Glass of Blood by a 19th century writer called Jean Rollin. In this story, Rollin described how, at the turn of the century, the French aristocracy would be prescribed a glass of freshly collected bull's blood as a cure for anemia. And this notion gives the film one of its most enduring and arresting images: a pair of well-dressed female aristocrats sipping glasses of bull's blood in a slaughterhouse. It is a sight that is both disturbing and surreal, their elegant gowns, one black and one white, marking a bizarre contrast against the blood-splattered floors and the ruddy-faced butcher who stands watching from the corner. Although the film uses this central motif as a springboard for the rest of the narrative, it is not strictly an adaptation of Lorrain's story. But given its literary inspiration, it is certainly appropriate that the opening shot is of a large illuminated book, its pages being turned slowly by a female hand. The book is in fact a large Lutheran Bible, suggesting a religious undertone that is not readily apparent for the rest of the film, though one might argue that the blood drinking which occurs may be seen as an inversion of communion. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. From here we see two girls dancing on a stone bridge and then immediately move to the slaughterhouse where we see the previously mentioned female aristocrats drinking their glasses of blood. As I mentioned, this scene is incredibly surreal and it is presented in a very painterly manner, one woman standing motionless in white as she waits for her companion to join her. This scene, of course, sets up the idea of blood drinking, and while this is not a vampire movie in the same vein as Rollin's earlier works, Fascination is certainly an homage to the idea of vampirism. And of course, it also incorporates the erotic elements of the vampire trope that we see in many of his earlier films. One of the women dips her finger in the blood and runs it around her lips seductively until she is scolded by their male companion, representing the patriarchy, who tells her, "This is not a game, it is therapy." He then indicates the ruddy-faced butcher with the lines, "Look at this man, who slaughters for a living and breathes in the smell of blood." Although I've not been able to find any quotes from Rollin confirming that Fascination has a political subtext, it's rather difficult not to see, in this opening vignette, a strong sense of class division, represented by the juxtaposition of the women with their surroundings. This notion also appears frequently in the largely improvised dialogue that is heard, rather sparingly, across the rest of the film, which contains numerous references to class and to the bourgeoisie. And then, of course, there is the basic premise of the film itself. female aristocrats seducing and devouring the blood of their male victims while surrounded by the trappings of luxury. As I say, I've not found any confirmation from Rollin that this was the case, but I have found a quote about his view on the political nature of fantastic cinema in general, in which he said, quote, "The fantastic cinema is always a good vehicle for discussing certain political ideas in the form of symbols and metaphors. In general, the fantastic cinema is always political because it is always in opposition. It is subversive and it is popular, which means it's dangerous. I made films with sex and violence at a time when censorship was very strong, so that was certainly a political statement as well, although again, not a conscious one. I just happen to have an imagination which doesn't correspond with those of certain conservative people." End quote. Whether consciously or unconsciously, the idea of class in Fascination is pretty hard to miss, and this is reinforced in the very next scene. Here we see a gang of robbers wearing, admittedly rather costume shop clothing of the poor, along with their well-dressed companion Mark, who strikes an incongruous note with his well-tailored black and red striped blazer and his rather jaunty bowler hat. He double-crosses the gang and steals their bag of gold for himself, taking the female gang member as a hostage to make good his escape. Mark is played by Jean-Marie Lemaire, and though I think he's rather good in the film, his performance has been called into question by many, including his co-star Brigitte Lahaie. People find him rather too over the top, and Lahaie has called his performance a little too grand guignol for the overall tone of the film. I disagree, but each their own. But while Mark may initially appear to be a villain among rather cartoonish villains, we soon discover that he has a moral compass, albeit a slightly wonky one. He promises his hostage that he is not going to kill her and that he will release her as soon as he reaches the coast, and he also rebuffs her when she offers herself sexually. Admittedly, he doesn't do it in the nicest way possible, laughing in her face in a manner that seems to enrage her even further, but it would appear that he has some morality nonetheless. This is followed by a rather clumsily choreographed scuffle, and his hostage flees to gather her companions, forcing Mark to take shelter at a nearby chateau. This, we correctly infer, is the setting for the two women dancing on the stone bridge that we saw earlier in the film. And indeed, a moment later, we see them looking from a window, a captivating image as they stare motionless, their white dresses caught in the wind. This scene, and all those which follow, reveal another key inspiration for the film, and this was Brigitte Lahaie, who had by now become something of a muse for Rollin. Lahaie plays the initially more dominant of the two women, Eva, while her companion Elizabeth is played by an actress called Franca. Mark makes his way inside and seeks the two women out, and here begins a rather clumsy game of hide-and-seek, which, at first glance, might seem more comedic than tense. The two girls seem to do all in their power to get themselves caught, noisily slamming doors behind them and coming directly to a window to stare inside as he watches. This, though, is of course their intention, for although they may initially appear to be helpless victims, as it soon transpires, they are, in fact, anything but. Mark might feel that he very much has the upper hand, but he is, in fact, walking into a trap. In some ways, the film is now a home invasion movie, if one can call a luxury chateau surrounded by a moat anything like a home. In such narratives, the female occupants are usually cast as victims, but it's quite clear from the outset that both Eva and Elizabeth are strong and independent. When Mark locks them in their room, they collapse into giggles, revealing that they have another key to the lock. And when he returns to find them laughing, they openly mock both the situation and his masculinity. "I see I don't frighten you anymore," he says, to which they reply, "No, we find you rather amusing, in spite of your big gun." Double entendre, if ever there was one. The two are also extremely sex-positive, their frequent nudity a sign of strength rather than vulnerability, particularly Brigitte Lahaie's Eva, who dominates every situation in which she finds herself right up to the final moments. Though perhaps finds herself is not really the right phrase, Because in every situation, it is she who is firmly in control and, in fact, seems to orchestrate most of them like an expert puppet master. This has led more than one commentator to call Fascination a feminist film, and indeed many have said this about much of Rollin's entire catalogue. Kat Ellinger, who co-directed the documentary Orchestrator of Storms, was asked about this at the time of her film's release, saying that it is no accident that Rollin's work has consistently drawn women as fans. Quote, "The women in his films, especially when it came to the vampire, were a far cry from what you saw in commercial film. They were often empowered. He used such things as the chthonic feminine or the Sidean feminine, which has a certain attraction for women like me. But because he's not commercial in a traditional sense, people often write off his films as too arty, not horror enough, and too sexual." End quote. Which is, of course, what I did myself back when I was about 25. Eva and Elizabeth also appear to be deeply in love, which leads to a rather drawn-out sapphic sex scene, one of many that we find in Rollin's movies. Of these, the director has said, quote, "About the love scenes, I must confess that for me, I prefer to see and show two girls naked rather than a girl and a man. For me, a naked girl is more interesting for sensuality and for poetry. A naked girl is always poetry." End quote. As I mentioned earlier, this scene, although it is very drawn out, is rather tame by today's cinematic standards. Though, had his co-producer had their way, it would have been far more explicit. This co-producer wanted Rollin to make a far more exploitative sex film, losing the emphasis on the fantastical elements, and he and Rollin had a constant battle during shooting. Of course, Rollin won out, and he would later say that Fascination was very close to what he originally envisioned, a film that was romantic but savage at the same time. As he would later describe it, quote, "It's quite arty, but although it is a vampire film, it pretty much avoids the pulp ideas which I usually worked into my scripts." End quote. After making love, the two women let themselves out of their locked room and return to the drawing room, where they rather jokingly threaten Mark with two daggers, an incredibly phallic image to match their earlier comments about his big gun. It soon becomes evident that their intention is to keep him there. When he momentarily regains the upper hand, Eva seduces him into staying, with an invitation that immediately recalls the children's adage about the spider and the fly. Quote, "Come into the parlour. You'll find a glass of our homemade bitter liqueur and a fire there. Later, when it gets dark, you can leave if you like. Come, and I'll tell you the story why we sent all the staff away from the chateau. And when it gets dark, you will know why the two of us are here alone." End quote. And when they leave, Elizabeth stares into the fire and strokes one of the daggers across her cheek, while giving us the quite delirious line, quote, "It's too late. You stumbled into Elizabeth and Eva's life, the universe of madness and death." End quote. Eva initially distracts Mark by having sex with him, while Elizabeth steals into the room and also steals his gun, though it seems momentarily that she is about to kill herself with it when she places the barrel in her mouth. Eva initially mistakes this for jealousy that she has had sex with Mark, which, as it turns out, it is, though not in the manner which Eva supposes. And this is perhaps where the film becomes less feminist, and, if I'm honest, slightly bizarre, as Elizabeth soon declares that she has fallen in love with Mark, and has felt that way since the moment he arrived. Given that he seems to have been at the chateau for all of an hour, this is falling pretty hard, even compared to the relatively quick seductions in some of the 1940s movies we've covered so far in the series. The sound of the gunshot, triggered accidentally, soon attracts the attention of the robber gang, and Mark once again attempts an escape. Determined to keep him there, Eva goes outside and confronts the robbers, offering them the bag of gold, while Mark and Elizabeth remain inside the chateau. Eva is taken to the nearby stables by the gang to count the money, and when Mark expresses concern for her safety, Elizabeth simply tells him not to worry, as Eva will soon be back. During the various exchanges that lead up to and take place during this point, we also learn the reason why the two girls wish to keep Mark at the chateau. There is to be a reunion that evening, the kind that should remain a secret from the servants, which is why they've all been sent away. And when Mark presses Elizabeth for more information and asks her who exactly is coming, there is a momentary break of the fourth wall as she stares directly at the camera to give her reply. Who is coming is Death. But Death actually turns up a little bit early, at least for the robber gang, as Eva demonstrates once again that she has the upper hand. Not that the main male robber seems to understand this. In the stable, he tells her to strip off her clothes while calling her a little bourgeois, saying, quote, "I'm giving the orders now. We're going to swap places. You give your dress to my wife and she goes for a walk in the park. And I'm going to treat you like I treat her." End quote. And this is exactly what he attempts to do, though once again Eva is far from being a victim. As the robber tells her that people like her think he's a crazy degenerate, she takes a black cloak from a hook and spreads it on the floor, hardly the actions of someone who is fearful for her life. And with good reason, as while they have sex, notably with her on top, she takes out a dagger and stabs him to death. We now come to the most famous shot of the movie, and indeed one of the most famous shots in the Rollin catalogue, and in French art house horror in general. Wrapping herself in the black cloak, Eva takes a scythe from the stables, dispatches the two remaining male robbers, and then approaches their female companion, who has indeed gone for a walk in the park. As Eva moves towards the camera, black cloak billowing and scythe carried in front of her, she represents a female Grim Reaper, killing this very last one of the robber gang with a sadistic smile of satisfaction plastered over her face. By now it is night time, and the rest of the guests arrive for the reunion. First the Marchioness, to whom the chateau belongs, played by Fanny Magier, and then a group of other women, all of whom are very excited to learn that Mark is in the house. One might wonder why, by this point, Mark hasn't just made a run for it, but it is clear that he believes he has the upper hand, a folly of his burgeoning masculinity that proves to be no match for the new arrivals. The Marchioness asks him if he minds if she examines him as if he were a horse, and it's quite clear that, to them, he is little more than livestock, akin to the carcasses we saw in the opening scenes, hanging limply in the slaughterhouse. During a beautifully candlelit scene, Eva and Elizabeth open the doors to the drawing room and bid Mark to enter. The Marchioness plays music on the same gramophone that we saw in the opening moments, and once again Mark tries to assert his masculinity by changing the record and forcing his companions into a far more energetic dance. He is then invited to join a game of blind man's buff, where once again he tries to assert his status by grabbing at the women's breasts to identify them, something that clearly makes Elizabeth uncomfortable, possibly through jealousy, and possibly because she knows too well what is coming next. Mark chooses the Marchioness, and the two leave for a bedroom, while Elizabeth warns that he will surely seek his revenge for their attempts at humiliating him. And indeed he does try, telling the Marchioness to get on her knees and threatening to burn her with a cigar. But while she may have a lower status physically at that moment, psychologically she is very much in control. When he stops short of actually burning her, she seems almost a little disappointed, hinting at the Sadean spirit mentioned by Kat Ellinger in the earlier quote in this episode. Eventually finding the body of the dead female bandit, Mark suddenly rebels and insists upon leaving, to which the Marchioness, instead of stopping him, simply offers him her horse. Of course, she has a plan to prevent him from actually getting anywhere. When he arrives at the stables, he is unaware of Eva and Elizabeth waiting in the shadows, and Eva is armed with an axe to stop him leaving once and for all. However, rather unexpectedly, it is not Mark who is killed by Eva, but Eva, who is shocked by her friend Elizabeth, who has unexpectedly chosen Mark over her. This leads to a rather tragic moment from the wounded Eva, who asks, "Why did you do it? You are my friend, and I loved you," before she tumbles from the stables and crawls, nearly dying, back towards the chateau. Sadly for Eva, though, at this point, the group of women reveal themselves to be not so much a sisterhood, but instead a predatory society, and actually far more patriarchal than we might have first imagined. They do not come to save her, but instead to drink her blood. This is again a rather beautiful moment, with Eva crawling across the bridge, her diaphanous gown blowing in the wind, but it is rather spoiled by the drawn-out blood-drinking scene which follows. As noted by Jonathan Rigby, this goes on for, quote, "an absurdly long time, particularly since the carnage is at no point convincing," end quote. Nevertheless, it does suggest that the aristocracy has no loyalty to anyone, not even each other, and that the only thing they care about is their own personal appetites. And this idea is underlined further as, returning to the barn, or more accurately, the pigeon loft, Elizabeth tells Mark the basic premise of the story. To be fair, though, given all that has happened by this stage, this is less of a reveal and more of a confirmation of everything that we already know. Years ago, the women were all treated with the medicinal glass of bull's blood, and developing a taste for it, now hold a reunion on a regular occasion to sample something much stronger. And this, of course, is the blood of young men, who are lured to the chateau by Elizabeth and Eva, and who are then consumed at the stroke of midnight. At this point, one expects that Elizabeth and Mark will make good their escape and give us what I suppose could be considered a happy ending. But at this point, Elizabeth has a sudden revelation that the love of blood is greater than that for the body in which it flows. She shoots Mark dead and returns to the chateau, and is greeted on the bridge by the Marchioness, who tells her that she looks quite beautiful with his blood across her lips. Fascination was filmed across the space of 2 weeks and was largely funded by Rollin's own money, though some small funds also came from the co-producer, who, as we said, wanted to make something far more explicit. Elegantly photographed by Rollin's cinematographer, Georges Fromentin, like the director's earlier work, it is less driven by narrative than it is by imagery, some of which is strikingly beautiful. This includes a momentary shot of light reflecting off a rushing river, the chateau surrounded by mist, Eva and Elizabeth in their white dresses, Brigitte Lahaie walking towards the camera with the scythe, and the final shots of Lahaie crawling across the stone bridge as her former companions walk menacingly towards her. Following the success of The Grapes of Death, Fascination was expected to be a success, but sadly this was not to be the case. It didn't receive the distribution in France that it should have, and the cinema chain UCG backed out of a distribution deal at the last minute. Although I've not been able to find any reliable box office figures for the time, I think it's fair to say that the release did not live up to expectations. It's really only been in more recent years that it has been reclaimed as Rollin's most accessible work, and also, as I mentioned, a feminist approach to sexuality and to vampire mythology. I also believe that, consciously or unconsciously, Fascination is a film about class and the decay of the bourgeoisie, with that very word repeated at least 4 times in its reasonably brief running time. Well, that's my interpretation, anyway. Rollin followed this with The Night of the Hunted, again starring Brigitte Lahaie, which marked a sharp contrast from his usual poetic imagery. A dark and dystopian science fiction story, kind of, about loss of memory, its rather sterile apartment setting is a far cry from the graveyards and the chateaux of his earlier film, and has led more than one person to compare it to David Cronenberg's Shivers, or They Came From Within. It's a rather good film too, with another great performance from Lahaie, even if some of the cast surrounding her are perhaps less than brilliant. Due to the restrictions of the budget, Rollin cast other pornographic actors, and it's fair to say that some of them prove that Lahaie's talent was an exception rather than the rule. Rollin continued to work in porn for a while, and of course also continued to direct his own brand of horror and fantasy, right up to his death in 2010. I don't have time to mention them all here, and as I said at the start of the episode, I have yet to watch many of them. But a special mention should go to his 1982 movie, The Living Dead Girl. In this, a young woman discovers that her childhood friend has become a cannibalistic zombie, again, kind of, and decides to help her by providing her with victims. Building on the idea from The Grapes of Death that zombies are self-aware and horrified by their actions, it is a strangely sad and melancholy tale, though it is, without question, the most violent Jean Rollin film that I have seen. After this, financing his films became more challenging, and Rollin also began to suffer significant health problems. Somehow, though, he continued to make cinema, often using Super 8 and lower-budget filming techniques. In 1995, he made a film called The Two Orphan Vampires, and in an interview reprinted in the book Fascination, The Celluloid Dreams of Jean Rollin, one of his cast spoke of her admiration for his commitment to his art. Quote, "Jean, I find, has integrity. He is faithful to his style. Without a lot of money, Jean makes his little films, and I admire him for it. I find it interesting, and I feel moved when I think of Jean, now in his 60s, and he's been fighting for years for this film genre. I find all of this quite moving. The integrity he has of keeping up the struggle, of continuing, not giving up, constantly striving, and of being recognised in his own way. I take my hat off to him." End quote. Happily, by this time, she was not the only one. In the 1990s, Rollin's work began to be rediscovered and re-evaluated, and he lived long enough to attend film festivals and events where he would be greeted by legions of new fans. He may not have achieved the success he wanted or indeed deserved in his prime, but at the very least, he knew that he was admired within his own lifetime. He died following a long battle with cancer and various other ailments on the 15th of December 2010. His final film, The Mask of Medusa, had been released just 1 year earlier. And so, it's fair to say that Jean Rollin remained an artist and a creative force right up to the very end. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is Strange Darling, released in 2024 and directed by JT Mollner. This stars Willa Fitzgerald, Kyle Gallner, Ed Begley Jr. and Barbara Hershey. Oddly enough, I realised when watching this week's films in preparation for this episode that Willa Fitzgerald, in this film at least, does bear a rather striking facial similarity to Brigitte Lahaie. However, this was not my reason for pairing them. And so, before I get into that reason, it's time to warn you once again that we are getting into the spoilers, and there is plenty in this film to spoil. So if you haven't seen Strange Darling yet, please consider pressing pause and watching the film before progressing any further. It works so much better if you go in blind, and I am about to give a fair amount of it away. Strange Darling is the second feature from JT Mollner, a former actor who was born in Las Vegas, Nevada, though his actual year of birth is rather difficult to ascertain. A lover of cinema from an early age, he credits his mother with his introduction to film, though the horror genre was most certainly off limits. He has recounted visiting the local video store with her when he was 6 or 7 and becoming fascinated with the lurid covers in the horror section. During these recollections, he described these covers as being, quote, blood-spraying knives and all this shit. I had such a good, happy experience as a child, but horror films fascinated me. They were so dark and strange, and the more I was told I couldn't see those movies, the more I wanted to watch them. End quote. So a fairly familiar story then to anyone who grew up in the 1980s, and also a fairly similar story to that of director Panos Cosmatos, whose early video store experiences we discussed in an episode earlier this year. And much as it did with Cosmatos, this ban fired up the young Mollner's imagination. Quote, Because I couldn't watch horror movies, I'd still see the covers for them at the video store, and my brain started creating things that were far worse and far more theatrical than you would ever see in the movies themselves. That must be something that had a little bit to do with the imagination that I ended up with. Since then, when stories come to me, I have to write them, and I have to make them." End quote. However, while she may have kept a watchful eye over his viewing habits, Mollner's mother was a little more laissez-faire when it came to his reading choices, allowing him to read any book he wanted. And so, possibly tempted by the forbidden promise of those old VHS covers, his reading materials tended towards the dark and the macabre. He has remembered that the first actual novel he read, while in the second grade, was Stephen King's Carrie, something which saw him sent to the school principal's office as a result. And quite brilliantly, his mother's response when they called her about this was to say that she wasn't about to discourage her son from reading. Good woman. This does, however, make the ban on horror movies somewhat contradictory, especially since the family sideline was a haunted house company called the Freakling Brothers, at which Mollner had been helping out since the age of 5. To be fair, though, that original attraction was less of a haunted house and more of a haunted garage, where his father, Duke, would challenge the neighbours to make it through unscathed. It soon became very popular, drawing lines around the block by the mid-1980s, and Mollner would later say that it automatically made him the most popular kid in school. By 1992, the business had become commercial and had grown to encompass 3 different haunted houses, all located in the same strip mall: Circus of Horrors, Castle Vampire, and the Gates of Hell, the latter of which became the first R-rated haunted house in the area. And by all accounts, Mollner still returns every Halloween to help out. When he grew up, he originally began working as an actor in Vegas, where he appeared in a year-long immersive theatre production at the Rio Hotel. But then, in 2005, he moved to LA to pursue a career in the film industry, taking acting jobs while writing screenplays on the side. His first screen role was in a TV series called Breaking Vegas, and further minor roles followed, including Reno 911, Miami Dirt, and Private Practice. But roles as a talent agent, bartender, and hot cowboy were hardly hitting the big time, and so he had to supplement this with bartending in real life. But the jobs paid the bills and allowed him to focus on what he really wanted to do, which was, of course, to make his own films. He made his first short film, The Red Room, in 2008, and others followed in relatively quick succession. These include 2015's Flowers in December, which is the story of a hard-living bad girl in her 50s whose obsession with a past love leads to madness, familial destruction, and quote-unquote far worse. This starred the legendary Dee Wallace, who is forever known by many as E.T.'s mum from the Steven Spielberg movie of the same name. But to lovers of horror, she is also known as Lynn from the original The Hills Have Eyes, Karen from The Howling, and Donna Trenton from Cujo, to name just a few. In 2010, Mollner began writing his first feature, a western inspired by films of the 1970s, though this would take 5 years to come to fruition, eventually going into production in 2015. Part of the reason for this was, of course, overcoming the typical Hollywood hurdles of financing, but it was also partly due to Mollner's attention to detail and his devotion to the craft of filmmaking. He wanted to wait until he could cast relatively well-known actors, and he also refused to shoot digitally, wanting instead to opt for vintage cameras and actual film stock. This, of course, is something that we also see in Strange Darling, which proudly announces that it was shot on 35mm before the credits have even rolled. On its release, some considered this pretentious, and you only have to look at Reddit to see exactly how many. But for me, it indicates somebody who is heavily invested in the quality of his films. And at least he doesn't call his movies a trip or a riff or some other nonsense, which is, to me, a far greater irritant. His debut film was called Outlaws and Angels, and it starred Luke Wilson, Chad Michael Murray, and Francesca Eastwood, the daughter of Clint. Shot entirely on Kodak film using Panavision cameras and vintage lenses, it premiered at the 2016 Sundance Film Festival and then went on to wider release in July of the same year. Sadly, though, it was not well received by the critics. The Hollywood Reporter said that it delivered shocks but came up short theatrically, and RogerEbert.com described it as being, quote, hopped up on the period piece sadism of Tarantino's regurgitation cinema. End quote. Although the release of the film enabled him to stop bartending, the mixed reviews and relatively poor returns did not exactly help his situation. He was writing plenty of screenplays, but he kept running into obstacles, with projects either not getting off the ground at all or ending up in development hell. All of this changed, however, once he had finished the screenplay for Strange Darling. He said that once he decided to make this, it was the quickest and easiest development process he had experienced thus far, finding himself beginning to shoot 4 months after the initial meeting with the financiers Miramax. Unfortunately, though, that very positive relationship wasn't going to last. Strange Darling originated from a central image, one which popped into Mollner's head when he was hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains near his home. The image was of a classic horror trope, the final girl, and in it she was running through the woods. Quote, I could see her running in slow motion, and I could hear the song Love Hurts. I even knew what the colours should look like. So I thought, where does this go? Is there a different side of the final girl that we could show in this story that starts where most horror movies end? And it blossomed into this. End quote. And what it blossomed into was a twisting, non-linear narrative that, much like our first film, subverts the classic tropes of the horror genre in ways that more than a few have found somewhat controversial, pointing at perceived messaging that they perceive to be problematic. Mollner himself has said that the film exists in a fantasy space, and that while some movies are meant to have a very specific moral or socio-political message, his isn't one of them. He went on to say, quote, some movies are meant to be understood narratively, and that's the main objective. They're procedurals. And some movies are meant to be felt. And this movie, above all else, is meant to be felt. And it's meant to be felt differently by different people in the audience. End quote. And this is certainly what happened. Some, myself included, see Strange Darling as a twisted thriller with some very, very dark comedic undertones. But others were far less than impressed by the gender dynamics, particularly coming in the wake of the Me Too movement. These people called it unpalatable, an elaborate excuse to dunk on women, and horrifyingly mean-spirited, with the most strongly worded critique saying, quote, were it in my power to unmake this self-important, cruel bit of fetishized misogyny, I would disappear it in a heartbeat. End quote. So, rather divisive film then. Part of this is driven by Strange Darling's subversion of horror and thriller archetypes, which, more often than not, do tend to fall into gendered divides. In this case, the archetypes are revealed in the opening credits, as we learn that actors Willa Fitzgerald and Kyle Gallner are playing characters called, respectively, the Lady and the Demon. Before this, though, we have black and white footage of the demon being asked if he is a serial killer, a jump cut to him strangling someone off camera, and then a piece of true crime reportage, voiced by the Lost Boys actor Jason Patric. And here, in a manner that is deliberately reminiscent of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we are given the following story. Quote, between 2018 and 2020, the most prolific and unique American serial killer of the 21st century went on a calculated multi-state spree that began in Denver, Colorado, continued through Grand Lake, and expanded across Wyoming and central Idaho, before culminating in the dense forests of Hood River County, Oregon. Drawing from police interviews, detailed accounts of eyewitnesses, depositions and observations of various law enforcement officials, this is a dramatization of the true story of the final known killings in that rampage. End quote. Immediately, we are then introduced to the lady, as Willa Fitzgerald recreates Mollner's original mental image, running across a field in slow motion as a version of the classic song Love Hurts blares on the soundtrack. As the lady is the central character in the movie, Mollner decided that the casting should be built around her. But although he had a vague mental image of her in his head, her actual age and appearance were very much left open. She could have been in her 20s, which is of course what he eventually decided on, but she could also have been in her 50s, much like Dee Wallace in his short film, Flowers in December. Quote, "I just wanted a vulnerability and a charisma, someone that you just had to look at, and a really great actor to be in that role." End quote. Interestingly, both lead actors were suggested right off the bat by a casting agent, though when Mollner originally met with Fitzgerald, she was actually a little younger than he had thought. He said that what convinced him she was right for the role was the compassion she had for the character, how she related to the role, and the fact that she could clearly see her character's point of view. The lady may have originally been intended as an archetype, but Fitzgerald saw her as a human being, saying, quote, "The thing that I was most interested in talking about, and the thing I wanted to ensure that we were both on the same page about, was my feelings for the character, and the love and sympathy and empathy I had for the character. I wanted to ensure that we were on the same page about that, and that we were telling the same story. To me, an essential part of the story is the humanity that is taking place, because it's the only thing that allows you to access having an emotional connection to the character." End quote. This approach becomes all the more understandable when you consider that Fitzgerald originally studied psychology for 3 years before she gained a theatre studies degree from Yale University. Born in 1991 in Nashville, her first screen role came in 2007 with the family movie For the Love of a Dog when she was just 16. After graduating in 2013, she secured guest spots in the TV shows Blue Bloods and The Following, before she moved on to play recurring characters in the TV series Royal Pains and Alpha House. Her biggest break came in 2015, when she starred as the character Emma Duval in the MTV series Scream, which she did for 2 seasons. She followed this with the BBC adaptation of Little Women, House of Cards, and Law & Order Special Victims Unit. In 2019, she appeared in the film adaptation of the Donna Tartt bestseller The Goldfinch, and it was this that really caught Mollner's attention, saying, quote, "I was a big fan of The Goldfinch, and Willa doesn't have a huge role in the movie, but she's one of the people I remember the most from the movie. It's very different from this role, but I knew she had that quality, and I could see her range, and how she kind of disappeared into different characters. And so for me, when I met her, it was all about, how is she going to work?" End quote. Well, work she certainly did, as she gives a blistering, no-holds-barred performance in a role that was both mentally and physically draining. She later said that it was one of the most physically demanding jobs that she had done, and this was very much exacerbated by the 12-hour-day shoots. Her preparation began as soon as she won the part, which was, in reality, only 4 weeks before she began filming. Starting by putting the non-linear script into sequential order to understand what happens to the character over the course of the movie, she was then in a position to understand exactly who the lady was, where she came from, and what her motivations really were. In more than one interview, she has described her character as a wounded animal, and in fact she studied videos of raccoons to help with the character's physicality. But the lady is also a fully realised human being, with pain, a history, and a past that made her into the person we see at the start of the film. Traditionally, she says, this type of depth has been reserved for male characters in cinema, particularly in genre productions. And so she was excited to play a complicated female lead who didn't have to be good by some moral standard or strong by a similar moral standard, but who was instead real, nuanced, and fascinating. After our slow-motion opening, the film immediately kicks into high gear, as does the non-linear structure. Telling us that the film is a thriller in 6 chapters, a counter on the screen rolls forward to Chapter 3, which is given the subheading, "Can you help me, please?" Immediately, we are dropped onto a highway in Oregon in the middle of a car chase. The lady is being pursued by the demon, who is played by Kyle Gallner. Kyle Gallner has been a fixture of the horror genre for many years now and has earned, if earned is the right word, the epithet of Scream King as a result. It has to be said, though, that much like the female equivalent Scream Queen, this term does diminish his career somewhat and reduces him down to an archetype, which is rather ironic given the nature of the film. Born in 1986 in Philadelphia, his first screen appearance was on the TV show Third Watch, which he followed with a brief role in the 2001 movie Wet Hot American Summer. Further TV guest roles followed, including Cold Case, Veronica Mars, Bones and Medium, as well as what seems to be a rite of passage for many an American actor when he appeared in 2 episodes of Law and Order. His first horror film came in 2005 in the Wes Craven film Red Eye, though given that his character was listed as Headphone Kid's brother, it quite possibly doesn't really count. Far more impactful was his role in 2009's The Haunting in Connecticut, a film supposedly based on a true story, if you want to believe it. In this, he plays a teenager possessed by evil forces after his family moves into a house that was once a funeral home, which, if nothing else, beats the trope of the ancient Indian burial ground, I guess. In the same year, he appeared as Colin in the cult movie Jennifer's Body, and the following year as Quentin in the misjudged and poorly received remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street. In 2011, he appeared in Red State from director Kevin Smith, and he followed this with a series of appearances in film and TV, including Criminal Minds, The Walking Dead, Dear White People, and American Sniper. He returned to horror with 2019's exorcism horror, The Cleansing Hour, and then, in 2022, hit a double with the reboot of Scream and Parker Finn's Smile. For me, though, Strange Darling aside, perhaps his best performance comes not from the horror genre, but from the dark and very quirky independent comedy drama Dinner in America, which was released in 2020. In this, he plays Simon, a punk singer on the run from the police, who forms a strange and incredibly touching relationship with the rather awkward Patty, who is played by Emily Skeggs. Although it struggled when first released in 2020, in 2024 it developed a following thanks to some clips going viral on TikTok, but don't let that put you off. If you've never seen it, then I highly recommend it, and although the first 20 minutes do make you wonder where the hell it is going, it's a film that's certainly well worth sticking with. Gallner's performance in Strange Darling is the equal of Fitzgerald's, and he invests the demon with an intensity and a ferocity that blazes from the screen. The two also share an incredible screen chemistry, something that was probably helped in no small part by their sharing an Airbnb along with their respective partners for the last half of the filming. After the demon forces the lady to crash and roll her car, she escapes and hides in the forest, the red of what appears to be her nurse's uniform contrasting sharply with the lush green of the trees. Strange Darling was photographed by actor and now cinematographer Giovanni Ribisi, here making his featured debut in the role, having previously shot music videos and commercials. Ribisi and Mollner had been friends for some time, and he says that when he heard Strange Darling had been financed, he plucked up the courage to see if he could work on the project. Ribisi has described cinematography as being the inversion of acting, calling the latter a subjective endeavour that wants to be objective, and cinematography an objective endeavour that wants to be subjective. Quote, "As a cinematographer, you're looking at something and evaluating it. Will this room have top light? Will there be a window? As opposed to being an actor, where you're asking yourself to use emotional perspectives to get to the point of, how does this person walk?" End quote. He has also said that, as a cinematographer, he was there very much to serve his director's vision, and in this he more than acquits himself. He said that what he and Mollner wanted to achieve was to have the lady and the demon existing in a kind of fairy tale, going on to say that the mission statement for the film was the idea of blood in a flower bed, with the flower bed representing a beautiful, surreal, and dreamlike world. A very appropriate metaphor indeed, as the lady manages to flee from the forest and eventually finds herself in a garden belonging to some quote-unquote mountain people. As she makes her way through the flower beds, the scene becomes more and more akin to something like The Wizard of Oz, or perhaps even Dr. Seuss, as among the flowers are planted loudspeakers, all of which are broadcasting some form of news bulletin. This, we later establish, is to keep the Sasquatch away. Surreal touches like these, the fact that the story is told out of sequence, the rolling chapter numbers that intercut the action, and the cinematography all place Strange Darling in a slightly fantasy world, one that is recognisable as modern-day America, but which still seems slightly adjacent, as opposed to being fully grounded in the here and now. This, then, is really a dark storybook reality, something which becomes all the more apparent as the chapters roll forward and we are presented with Chapter 5, subtitled Here Kitty Kitty. There have been those who call this approach to storytelling more than a little pretentious, and still more who have suggested that it is obviously hiding a twist, leading them to guess the turnabout that happens at the midpoint of the film. Personally, I dismiss the first accusation. Just because something isn't to your taste, it doesn't make it pretentious, unless, of course, it's directed by Nicholas Winding Refn. However, I would agree to some extent that the obfuscation is, ironically, a little too clear. We do, after all, live in a post-M. Night Shyamalan world, and audiences are now far more educated in the art of the cinematic 180 than we were back in the early 2000s. Certainly, when I first saw it at its 2024 Fright Fest screening, I did guess at the reveal rather early on, though I also found myself second-guessing that first guess and coming up with all sorts of other possibilities as well, which for me was part of the fun. For a brief moment, though, the film wasn't going to be presented in this fashion at all, and was almost delivered in a far more straightforward linear form. At least, it would have been, if Studio Miramax had had its way. In fact, had they had their way early enough, the film wouldn't have been made at all. Although they had given Mollner a lot of support during pre-production, 2 days into filming, executives shut the production down, saying that they hated everything that had been shot and insisting that Willa Fitzgerald be recast. Although the week-long shutdown was eventually settled, mainly due to the interventions of the producers, who reminded Miramax that millions had already been spent, this was an incredibly traumatic experience for all involved, and Mollner would later say that for the rest of filming, he felt as if he was directing to save his career. And unfortunately, tension with Miramax continued even after the filming wrapped. Although the screenplay that Miramax had signed off on had always taken the narrative backwards and forwards, during post-production, an executive decided that a linear cut would work far better and would be less confusing for the audience, which I guess means that he personally didn't really understand it. And so, without Mollner's knowledge, he hired another editor to deliver just that. Mollner was understandably infuriated and went and spoke to Bill Block, the head of Miramax. Block then suggested that they hold a test screening of Mollner's original director's cut, and fortunately, the response was so positive that he agreed the studio should release the original concept. Of course, this is not the first time we have heard of studios doing things like this, and on those occasions where they win out, it seems it rarely ends happily, either for the filmmaker or indeed the viewer. So it is extremely positive that this version has a happy ending, and to his credit, Bill Block did later apologise to Mollner for the stress caused during production. But it is yet another example of why some studio executives should really just watch the money and let the creatives get on with what they were actually hired to do in the first place. It happens again next week, by the way, and it's not such a positive outcome. And so, thankfully, from here, we are now able to roll all the way back to Chapter 1, now partway through the story, as intended, and a sequence subtitled Mr. Snuffle. As we all know by now, not least from my earlier descriptions of Jean Rollin movies, I'm a bit of a sucker for a screen flooded with colour, and this sequence, bathed in a vivid blue, hit me right where I live. It's also a scene where Mollner really spells out the notion of the gender dynamics that underpin the plot, as the lady and the demon, parked in his truck, discuss the next step in their one-night stand. "You know, the real issue is safety," she tells him. Quote, "Once I'm alone with you in that room, it's just us. No witnesses. Do you know the kind of risks a woman like me takes every time she agrees to have a little bit of fun? It's a goddamn tragedy. Men think that we're these prudes who don't like casual sex. Most of us fucking love casual sex. We just want to know that murder isn't going to be served on the side." End quote. And when the demon says, "Jesus, I've never thought of it like that," her response is, quote, "Of course you haven't. You're not a woman." End quote. Dialogue like this, and the scenes that immediately follow, are partly what inflamed many of the film's most vocal critics. While Mollner is certainly toying with audience expectations and perceptions, one can see why some viewers had a hard time believing that he wasn't just trying to have his cake and eat it. On the one hand, he is expressing an actual truth about the dangers for women in the world of modern dating, and on the other, well, we'll get to that in a moment. Willa Fitzgerald, however, believes that this dialogue is less a statement of the film's intent and more of a revelation about her character, saying that, at this point, everything that she is saying is sincere, earnest, and not manipulative, and that the lady is fundamentally talking about a lack of safety that she personally feels in the world. Quote, "She is constantly reaching out to other people to try and feel a connection to them, and is constantly thwarted by something that feels incredibly real." End quote. The connection that she is looking for is in fact sadomasochistic sex, and this leads to some genuinely uncomfortable moments that deal with violence and consent, although these are, much to our relief, revealed as role-playing and game-playing, initially at least. Once again then, Mollner is messing with our perceptions, a game that is greatly enhanced by the performances of his two leads. Gallner is suddenly terrifying, and Fitzgerald is seemingly helpless and frightened. As I say, it is a deeply uncomfortable watch for a few moments, and it was also something that Gallner, in particular, was very cautious of. He later said that many conversations were had to ensure that his co-star and he understood that both of them were always safe. Quote, "There is a lot of nuance and a lot of things happening. So it's navigating that conversation of consent, combined with what are the characters doing and where are they, and what does consent mean in this moment and what doesn't it mean in that moment, and where are we going from one place to the next." End quote. As I mentioned, it turns out happily that what we have been watching is roleplay, revealed by the rather hilarious safe word of Mr. Snuffleupagus, who, as some of you will remember, was Big Bird's imaginary woolly mammoth friend on the kids' TV show Sesame Street. Probably not the first thing I would think of in a sexual situation, though the fact that Mr. Snuffleupagus is both real and imaginary does fit in with the shifting nature of Fitzgerald's character. And for a moment, it does seem as though there is actually a connection between the two characters, something that makes Strange Darling a twisted love story as well as a twisted thriller. Fitzgerald has said that the fundamental quest for the lady is one of connection, and that for a moment, at least, there is an undeniable truth to the connection she feels with the demon in that motel room. As a result, she has described these scenes as being beautiful and heartbreaking, because, for just that moment, a completely different outcome seems almost possible, even if what eventually comes to pass is ultimately fated. And so, sadly, just as they are kissing, the lady sees a flash of something, and her whole demeanour begins to change. Of course, what is really going on is that the lady is actually the killer spoken of in the opening crawl, the most prolific and unique American serial killer of the 21st century. And this is revealed in our next chapter, Chapter 4, where we meet the Mountain People, Genevieve and Frederick, who are played by Barbara Hershey and Ed Begley Jr. Until this point, the film has been relatively low on humour, and these two characters provide some much-needed comic relief, cooking their breakfast in half a pound of butter and topping it with more butter, maple syrup, fruit preserve, and then lashings of cream. If nothing else, they are an advert for the type of retirement I would like to be having, should we all live for that long. Less appealing, perhaps, is their choice of recreation, which is assembling a jigsaw puzzle of the insufferable actor Scott Baio. Though, as Frederick points out, this is not because they are fans, it is because it was the only one left at Goodwill. As is so often the case, though, the comedy soon turns to tragedy, as the lady's true nature is revealed first to Frederick, then to Genevieve, and finally to the audience, though many may well have guessed it already by this stage. Not that that matters particularly, as it comes midway through the movie, there is still much to be enjoyed after this is revealed. Flashing back then to the motel and Chapter 2, we now know who we are dealing with, and we watch as the lady drugs the demon with ketamine, which she has given him in the guise of cocaine. What follows is a torture sequence, hidden beneath a black screen which indicates the passage of time, and here, once again, we have some very, very dark comedy that certainly prompted the audience I was with to laugh rather uncomfortably, even though we knew we probably shouldn't. We also have a very nice moment in a blood-red bathroom, sorry, it's me and my colour schemes again, and a sequence of genuine sadism as the lady toys with the wound she has inflicted on the demon's chest. This is a carving of the letters EL, which, as we later discover, stands for her alias, the Electric Lady. And so, at the same time, we discover that her name in the opening credits was not, in fact, just a horror archetype, but an abbreviation of the name given to her by the media. And when she later reveals that she doesn't see men, she sees demons, we not only have an explanation for the momentary flashing image that ended her connection in the motel room, we also get an explanation for the male character's name as well. This about-face added to the outrage expressed by some critics, who reflected on the lady's earlier speech in the truck about the dangers of casual sex, and saw it, rightly or wrongly, as a mockery of the genuine dangers that women are exposed to. As we've already discussed, Fitzgerald's interpretation is very, very different to this, and that the fear expressed by her in that scene is very real, even if it is being expressed by somebody who turns out to be a danger herself. She also resists the idea that the lady is a psychopath, saying that for her the film is not really the story of a killer, but rather something else entirely. Quote, "I feel like when we talk about this idea of a psychopath, there's a sense that there's a lack of empathy or understanding, and I think that really what we're seeing is an exploration, an allegory of what it means to be your own worst enemy. Because ultimately, it's these things that are happening for her that are maybe not happening externally that are ruining her chances of connection, which is ultimately the very thing that she's most deeply seeking." End quote. More contentious, perhaps, is the lady's method of gaining the trust of some of her victims, in that she manipulates the notion of a scared and vulnerable woman in order to gain the upper hand. This, of course, fits with Mollner's continual manipulation of viewer expectations, but others have suggested that it flies in the face of the lessons learned from the Me Too movement. Certainly, many were outraged by it, and they are entitled to their opinions. But equally, there were also many, of all genders, who loved it. So, even though I have given away the twist in the middle of the film, with 1.5 more chapters and an epilogue to go, I have decided to not reveal any more. Needless to say, there is far more carnage ahead, and also more of Ribisi's compelling cinematography, most notably a one-take backward tracking shot and an extraordinary sequence where the vivid colours on screen slowly drain to black and white. Like I said, I'm a sucker for an effective use of colour. Aside from the points already discussed, I guess the big question is, does Strange Darling stand the test of time once you know the twist? Personally, I think it does. It's certainly fun to watch it a second time and see all the things you missed, most notably why the demon is inhaling so much cocaine as he pursues the lady in the opening car chase. Turns out he's not just some hopped-up cokehead after all. But even beyond that, I think the film bears repeated viewing, and not just for the colour grading, though that is a big part of it. There are, of course, the fiery, committed performances from the leads, the very black humour, and also a very beautiful score, composed by Craig de Leon and featuring songs by indie musician and friend of Mollner's, the artist Zeeberg. Strange Darling premiered on the 22nd of September 2023 at Fantastic Fest in Austin, Texas, and in March 2024 it was acquired for North American distribution by Magenta Light Studios. It opened in Australia on the 22nd of August 2024 and was released in the US a day later, on the 23rd. In the UK, it premiered at Fright Fest and was released theatrically on the 20th of September. We have, of course, already referenced some of the more negative reviews, but there were many others that were far more positive. IndieWire called it electric and unforgettable. The Washington Post praised the cinematography and, of course, the performances, and the New York Times was equally as positive, saying, quote, "Playing out in 6 ingeniously scrambled chapters, this headlong thriller transforms a simple cat-and-mouse premise, and maybe even a toxic love story, into an impertinent rebuke to genre cliches and our own pre-programmed assumptions." End quote. Strange Darling also received multiple nominations at the 2025 Saturn Awards, including Best Direction, Best Writing, Best Actor in a Film, Best Actress in a Film, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Editing. And while it might not have triumphed in any of those categories, it did take home Best Thriller. In the same year that Strange Darling was released, Willa Fitzgerald gave another memorable performance in the horror genre, this time as young Madeline in Mike Flanagan's The Fall of the House of Usher. Since then, she has appeared in 3 more feature films and starred in a major role in the medical TV drama Pulse. And also in the same year as Strange Darling, Kyle Gallner played another menacing character in the psychological thriller The Passenger, and a year later returned, albeit briefly, in the horror sequel Smile 2. This year we will see him opposite Samara Weaving in the crime drama Carolina Caroline. We'll also see him in a thriller called Just Breathe and a psychological drama called Cotton Fever. JT Mollner went from directing Strange Darling to writing the screenplay for one of the major genre pictures of 2025, the movie adaptation of Stephen King's The Long Walk. Reflecting on his experience of working on Strange Darling with Fitzgerald and Gallner, he later said, quote, "Willa and Kyle are both very special. The film really depends on them doing their jobs well, and they exceeded my expectations. Not only have they become very dear friends, but I also can't wait to work with both of them again." End quote. And, as it turns out, he didn't have to wait too long. As of the time of recording, the 3 are reunited on the set of his next film, a modern take on the creature feature called Skeletons, which is due to be released sometime in 2027. Last week, I rather facetiously announced that Fascination and Strange Darling were about damsels in distress, and of course nothing could really be further from the truth. That I couldn't really say as much without giving everything away. In both films, we are presented with female characters positioned initially as classic horror stereotypes, defenseless victims of a home invasion in one, and the classic final girl pursued by a killer in the other. But by the midpoint of both films, we have had our expectations completely torn apart, with the female characters outsmarting and outmaneuvering their male counterparts at every turn. Filled with startling imagery, both are set in worlds that are recognisable yet storybook, and both also have a fair amount to say about sex, although admittedly, one is slightly more explicit than the other. The first has been reclaimed as a feminist take on the vampire, and the second criticised by some for supposedly misogynistic tropes. But regardless of where you stand on either of those debates, together both films remind us that sometimes the most effective horror stories are produced not by delivering horror tropes, but by turning them completely on their head. Next week, we are staying with the controversial, the strange and the surreal with a double bill that takes us off to the circus. First up, we have the highly controversial for its time, and even today, Freaks from 1932 and director Todd Browning. This stars Olga Baklanova, Harry Earls, Johnny Eck and Henry Victor. And then we follow this with the surreal Santa Sangre from 1989 and director Alejandro Jodorowsky. This stars Axel Jodorowsky, Adam Jodorowsky, Blanca Gurla, Guy Stockwell and Thelma Tixu. If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please also consider sharing it with any horror-loving friends. As always, you can write to the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow our Instagram at thehorrordouble. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.